Why doesn't Arnold read when he comes home from school?
How much science and math do you teach?
Do you let them be lazy, or do they really have to study? What do they get out of clubs and things like student councils?
Thank you for your questions. We believe this movie will answer some of them.
He was a man by the name of Ishmael Utley, and he was something else. I remember specifically coming to class one day, and he was standing on the desk, just standing there. And so he waited until all of us got into the classroom, and of course we were all just kind of wondering, what in the world is this man going to do now? And then he leaned forward and he said, "It is a sin to bore students." Then he backed up. He waited. He leaned forward and he said it again. Backed up. Then he leaned forward and he said it again. "It is a sin to bore students." And then he jumped off the table.
You think back to all the teachers that you really liked and what did they bring to the table. And for me, that was always a fascination with the subject matter, a curiosity about the subject matter, and engagement with it, and the teachers seemed to kind of embody what they taught.
The one teacher who shaped me the most is named Maureen Conway. And I first met her when I was a third grader. I think a lot of us know someone like this. They're maybe often a social studies teacher who just thinks like they're going to change the world through their students. And she just loved the idea of America and hated the things that had gone wrong with America, but she was so passionate and so idealistic, but also so committed to the study of the past as something we need to do well. So she was very future facing, but also, understood we have to approach the past as a foreign country.
I think back to chemistry in high school, and I had a teacher, Mr. Lundeen. I actually many years later wrote him this letter, and I was failing chemistry. Mr. Lundeen set up a time after school with me and tutored me, and I just couldn't get chemistry. And he spent hours with me teaching me how to do chemistry. And I remember it wasn't so much the grade I walked away with or whatever, but he empowered me to have this recognition that it didn't matter what I knew or didn't know, what I was good at or wasn't good at, is that if I worked hard enough, if I was willing to open my mind and try something that scared me, is that I could accomplish anything.
I remember very distinctly as a fourth grader and a fifth grader watching my teachers teach and literally critiquing their teaching in my head and thinking, if you did this, we would learn better, or if you did that, we would learn better.
In high school, I was really fortunate to have amazing English and social studies teachers who would ask us really good open-ended questions and get us thinking about how ideas from the past related to the present.
I can remember a high school teacher, his name was George Dreyer, who, when I was pontificating seemingly that I was going to go into physics, took the time to take me aside and said, "Peterson, if you're going to do physics, you got to get a lot more serious about mathematics." Now, for me, that's what I needed to hear that day. But most of my teachers would not have taken the time to even say that.
I was going to be a clinician. I was going to figure out how to help people with mental problems and so on, and I was going to do that through psychology. I found out that I really hated it, the clinical aspects of it. I was really a behavioral cognitive psychologist. I wasn't clinician material. And I just kind of figured that out, partly from watching and working under really good professors. One primary one was an undergraduate instructor in my area in experimental psychology. This was John Allen, just because of how he approached his field and how he approached the teaching of it. He also was not a particularly gregarious kind of instructor. I mean, he clearly really loved his field. Once I'd realized I wasn't going to be a clinician, then I thought, no, it's really this area that John Allen taught me that is the area I really love.
It was a ceramics class with Gene Johnson, and that kind of transformed my life. And it was one of those experiences where once I started taking studio classes, it was like, oh, this is what I've been doing all my life, as I've kind of been doing this thing, but I never really called it art, and nobody in my life ever called it art. It was just something that Ken did. And so I got here and I took this class, and it was kind of a very transformative experience. And I pretty much, that first year I just lived in the studios, you know. All my other classes went right down the crapper, so to speak.
My professors at Wheaton, especially in the English department, clearly loved what they did and drew intellectual and spiritual sustenance from the text that they were teaching, and they talked a lot about that, not in a preachy way, but in a very kind of whole cloth sort of way. And I thought, wow, I want to be a part of a community that is like that, and I want to help encourage students that I would teach to do that kind of integration of faith and learning.
I didn't have very many female role models. I had a very influential female math professor in grad school, and she influenced me quite a bit to see that I could be a strong, articulate woman in math and sciences because I hadn't seen that modeled at all.
Many of the things that I do right now as an instructor came from my graduate training, because they taught in a way that I had never seen or experienced. In some ways, they brought me back to some of the things that maybe my elementary teachers did in terms of how they had students working together in groups, but I had never seen it done with 500 students in a large lecture setting.
I did have a wonderful graduate advisor named Paul Fussell, and he wrote a lot about war. He was in World War II. He wrote a great book about World War I, but he was an 18th century scholar. And he was also a journalist. He wrote for the New Republic and other magazines. So he embodied both the public side with that, he called it high journalism. It was very much like Swift and Samuel Johnson, with serious literary study. And that appealed to me immensely.
I worked for a principal once who said, yeah, years 4 to 7 are your peak years of teaching. And I thought, well, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? I mean, 7 years in, I was 29 years old, so that was a long time ago. It stirred me to kind of think about, okay, after year 7, how do I continue to have peak years?
A graduate student at the University of Colorado who was teaching a short story literature course. This was a freshman class I was taking as a senior. It was a pass-fail course. We read The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And he would give us like 3 or 4 questions. We could pick one question to write an essay about. And the question was, compare Conrad's use of light and dark with good and evil. And I really got into it. Some hidden door opened, and I was passionate about that question, and I spent hours and hours pawing through this novella. By the end of my research, I had 29 pages of notes. Any essay, we were limited to one piece of paper, 8.5 by 11. We could type on both sides. That was his limitation for our essays. So I have 29 pages of notes, and I have to basically get it down to about 2.5, 3 pages. And so I went in to see him and was talking with him about it. And he asked me what this sheaf of papers I was carrying, what that was. And I said, it's my notes. And he paused and he looked at me and he said, "Would you like to make this your class project?" What? Do something that's not on the syllabus? Do something that actually I'm excited about? It was life-changing.
The metaphor of pilgrimage, I think, is a very powerful one. It's also a holy image. In pilgrimage, you have some sense of where you're going, but not a complete sense of where you're going. And there are all kinds of way stations along the way. You depend upon the hospitality of many others, such as colleagues and students. You get sometimes tricked into doing things that you hadn't counted on, like team teaching or traveling with students that turn out to be as important as your original plans. And the things that happen along the way are as important, if not more important, than the final destination.
There were some good things about being a new teacher. It was good that I was young so I could connect with them. My favorite thing to do when I was teaching at the University of Oklahoma, it was big enough there that I would just come in on the first day and walk in and I would sit amongst the students and I'd talk to people next to me and say, "Oh, what do you think this class is going to be like?" And just kind of blend in and talk with them. And then when it was time to start the class, I'd walk up and go to the front, and the person who I'd been talking to kind of gasped. "Who was that?" "Oh, that was the prof."
I was an excellent public speaker. I had spoken all over the U.S. I was so confident, I was unbearable as far as my public speaking. So that part, I thought, oh, wow, every day I'm going to give us all these speeches. And I knew I was good at that. What I wasn't good at was just the nitty-gritty. I could do a daily schedule for a syllabus, and I could get up and lecture. But that's all the farther it went. So it wasn't until I came to Bethel that I really began to realize that I had to reach beyond what I had been doing. Just being a good public speaker wasn't going to cut it.
Believe it or not, a lot of what I learned in working with 4th through 5th graders had relevance to working with college students. I needed to break out of the idea that college teaching is somehow different, than teaching at the elementary level. And I think I walked into college teaching thinking that I could perhaps lecture a little bit more than I could with a 4th or 5th grader. And I learned that that's maybe not true as well.
The dean who sat in on my class that first year said, even a lecture is an implied conversation. And I think most good teachers at Bethel, they know that. And even the ones who like lecturing, they realize it's an implied conversation. But that implies that you're actually listening along with the students to what you're saying and asking yourself what questions they might have or could have if you make the material interesting enough.
I went back through my experience in high school and college and pulled up in my mind the teachers that were most effective for me. And it didn't take long to pull out the the way they interacted with students on a one-to-one basis, the way they planned their classes in a different way than just lecture. And so those things became a very important part.
There were many things to learn as a young teacher, and I think if there is summarizing thought, it's that I did not realize I had the most to learn from the students, more than even from my colleagues.
As I look at today's students as a whole group, the primary way that they're so different from the students I started out teaching long ago is that they seem to think they should have already decided who they're going to be and what they're going to be doing for the rest of their life when they come in, when they come walking in. And I will confess I have already to have done that myself when I was an undergrad. But I was wrong. I was wrong about where I thought I would end up. And so I had to discover as I went along that, you know, your pathway unfolds in front of you. It's not already laid out there exactly where it's going to be so that all you have to do is walk it. It unfolds as you go along because you have to discover the terrain as you're progressing so that you can decide whether it's still the right direction for you to go. So if you come in with too fixed of an idea at the beginning of exactly where you're going to end up at the end, oh, you're going to have a terrible struggle and you're never going to enjoy it. And the journey is the fun part.
The environment of the student right now that's coming to Bethel, they are coming from a culture of assessment in K-12 education that we've created after the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. You know, and what this has done is this has shaped educational experiences into finely crafted packages, content packages, with very clear outcomes, very clear objectives. And students very seldom now experience situations where they have to face open-ended questions, you know, things, you know, ambiguity, like the potential for multiple outcomes, you know, situations like that. So that's very challenging for them. Frankly, this class that I designed called Creative Practices is entirely about sort of addressing this specific issue. It's like, how do you get students to experiment? How do you get them to sort of invest in all of these things that we want them to do that they don't have time to do because college is super expensive and they're trying to get out of here as fast as they can. Everything about their experience in education up until that point has suggested that failure is always negative in every aspect. Failure is never generative. It never sort of kicks out any other ideas because the standards and the objectives and the goals are always predetermined. It's like, bam, this is it. And if you don't hit that, well, you're just not a very good student, or you're not smart, or you're not working hard enough. So all those things are judgmental, first of all, and they're also very isolating. They're like I said, they're not generative. They don't sort of lead anywhere else.
I sense in my students, and have for the last 3 to 5 years, this fear that they are not acceptable, that something's wrong, they're not acceptable. And makes me very, very sad. But they are whom the Lord has created for whatever reason.
I think students come into my classroom with a certain level of belief in their own abilities, and I would say that never matches my belief in their abilities. For the most part, I think that my students can do way, way more than they think they can do. You know, sort of the natural thing when you grow up, you sort of learn what the potentials are. And I love that in my class, you know, I will frequently, almost, you know, every project, you know, students will work and I kind of feel it's my job to raise those expectations. It's like, oh, by the way, this, you know, just, I'll ask questions like this. It's like, what if I told you to make this 100 times bigger? You know, and students, I mean, they will literally laugh. It's like, oh, that would be impossible. Like, there's no way I could do this. Like, oh, let's talk about that. And so I kind of show them what that would actually look like. And pretty often, students will then sort of turn around and make the project 100 times bigger, you know, than what it was.
Probably the most formative metaphor for me comes from Parker Palmer. He's written several books about teaching. One of them is called To Know as We Are Known, and the line is, "To teach is to create a space in which obedience to truth is practiced." And in that book and in some of his other writings, he sort of unpacks that sentence. I would say the line in that definition that I have found most formative in thinking about what would my metaphor for teaching be is create a space. And so at times I think literally, physically, what is it about the particular space of a specific classroom where I'm going to be teaching? To the extent possible, what can I do to make that space more conducive to the kind of learning I would like to see happen with this particular group of students in this particular class? And sometimes space is more conceptual or more metaphorical. What can I do to help invite individual reflection as well as group consideration of ideas? Thinking about that metaphor and the idea of space has more recently led me to read a lot about just the whole notion of hospitality. What does a good host do to create a hospitable space? And so thinking about myself as host, my students as guests, but then what about the text that we bring into class? How are the things I'm asking my students to read in a way like guests that we are inviting into the room? So how can I help my students learn to be good hosts to those guests, to practice hermeneutical hospitality, I guess, towards the things we're reading?
Our world right now is increasingly siloed, if you will. Like everybody, even in 10th grade, is like, this is what I want to be, and I only want to go to a school that's going to get me this specific narrow window of training and then get me to my job. And we miss so much in that. Like even the issues that we're dealing with in biology, like how do we feed more people by 2050, which is increasingly close, right? How do we basically double our food supply by 2050? That's not a solution that you can solve only through the lens of science. You have to have the historical perspective, you need the social policy perspective, you need the political aspect of things. So all of these pieces have to come together in order to be able to solve some of these big global issues. Biology just brings one lens. And so the humanities speak into that tremendously, just as the sciences do. And I think if you isolate yourself, you don't get all of those voices in the conversation, and your solution is either A, not going to work, or B, not be as innovative as it could be.
The liberal arts gives them well-rounded skills to be a better human, you know, and to be a better human ties into what you'll do in your professional life, but it also ties into how you'll live in your neighborhood and how you'll live in your community and in your society, and to be engaged in civic life and to live well in your spiritual community. And I think the liberal arts do that because we introduce students to a history of ideas and a history of social problems that they really have to wrestle with and come to understand that the ideas haven't always been the same, and that humans make their way through difficult times, and that there's universal aspects of being human, whether it's suffering or joy, and how we make meaning.
It's a way of noticing more of what's in the world and noticing more about yourself. Literature always interrogates the reader, noticing more about other people's experiences, noticing more about the history of the world and just how marvelous this is. It's also fun. It's just, that's our first, some of our first games are language games, that we love Dr. Seuss, and then somehow formal education beats that love out of them, trying to find the big themes in the story. Man versus nature, man versus man, all those themes that we grew up with, instead of just reminding that your first games were playing with sounds, and that's what these poets and writers are doing.
Literature should delight and instruct. Horace said it, Sir Philip Sidney said it, so it must be true. And in a way you can't get any deeper than that. It delights by instructing. it delights, and then it instructs. Nobody quite knows how they go together, but I think everybody understands that the two are related.
I think learning to appreciate beauty is an important part of being a Christian and important part of being a human, and one of the most beautiful things that exists is a well-crafted sentence, a beautiful image in a poem. I think of the experience I have reading a poem about an experience that I've had or a place that I've been, and I think that word is exactly right. That way of saying it is exactly right, kind of this level of resonance.
Life becomes so familiar that we forget to look at it. I take the same road to work every day, and so I don't look at it anymore. And what the writer and what the artist do largely, I think, is point out how magical and marvelous and also painful at different times our lives are, and the world that we move through is.
You can approach life totally from the emotional side, or you can enhance the rational side of your person. And to be a really well-balanced person who's going to deal fruitfully, successfully with life in all of its aspects, that rational thinking part has got to grow too. And that's what the sciences are really so good at. You know, what are you going to do with the evidence that's around you? What are you even going to call evidence of why things happen? I've just been convinced from the very beginning. I think that real success in life comes not just from kind of bumbling your way through it, but from being able to some degree to analyze what's happening and why it's happening. It's one thing to just use internal subjective lines of evidence, you know, well, this is what I feel, so that must be what so-and-so is feeling. And that must be why they did, you know, why they did what they did. But it's another thing to look at individuals, other people more objectively, and groups of people more objectively, and even the natural world more objectively. And there's going to be a lot of non-intuitive reasons that are going to come to light when you take that approach to trying to understand what's happening around you. And so it's those non-intuitive things that you have to get by other means, by a more objective looking at the world.
The way that at least I approach it is teaching it like you're a scientist. So we take every day as an opportunity to do a mini experiment. We may not be hands-on, you know, manipulating something in the lab, but I think that makes it really fun when you can go in every day and say, even though I might know the answer and where the students are going to end up at the end of the day, they don't know that answer. And the way that they get there is going to vary depending on the choices that they make during the session. So really just embracing the idea of teaching science as science is practiced, and telling my freshmen, hey, you're going to learn the skills of being a scientist right now, because we're going to do them every day. And so by the time even you finish this semester, you're going to be fluid in kind of the approach and the ways that scientists conduct themselves, so that you're going to be on your trajectory to becoming a scientist.
Students can begin to see how hard it is to solve problems in the real world, even just starting to comprehend what is the problem, because until that point a lot of their problems have just been written up in a textbook. So getting the problem has been easy because it's just been handed to them. As a mathematician, you need to be a problem solver. So to be a good problem solver, you've got to have this multifaceted foundation to build upon. And you also have to be able to interact with a lot of different types of people. So to be able to understand people and where they're coming from and see the different lenses, and kind of to be maybe jerked out of a particular pathway that they might be going in, because they might just think in a particular way, and to see, oh wow, somebody is thinking about this in a totally different way. That's very helpful to make the person a more robust problem solver.
People have certain gifts that we're born with, to see things objectively, to see things subjectively, to see things emotionally, to see things cold-heartedly, objective, see things up close, see things from afar, be able to introspect. These are all ways that we engage with the world. And so what is liberal arts education but helping people develop all of those? And it's not just about your strength, it's about recognizing your weaknesses and saying, I don't want this to be a weakness. I can, maybe I can't do it, but at least I can increase my understanding of the importance of empirical research, or the importance of logic, or the importance of actual reflection on experience.
Why do we believe in equality? And what do we do when freedom to form different groups, the freedom to act as we want, bumps up against equality? The great questions of democracy. Who are the gods? What are the gods? What is God? Do we make God in our own image? Is it merely a social construct, as we misuse that phrase today? Or is there something beyond it? These are questions that can't be answered through your vocational life, through business. They can't be answered strictly through science. They're the questions that make us human. And our society depends on having people who can ask those questions as they arise in new forms in every generation, which they always do and always will. No one has ever imagined a free society of uneducated people. It can't be done. And we're engaged in an experiment which may succeed, but may very well not succeed, based on our ability to have enough people willing to ask those kinds of questions and to pay attention to the answers.
I look at my job as teaching the students to pay attention. That, to me, that's the great theme of literature, and that's the great theme of education. Other disciplines do it in other ways. That in literature we pay attention through plot, through character, through metaphor, description, image, symbol, things like that. Other disciplines pay attention through a microscope, through a telescope, through the sounds and rhythms of music, through the textures and colors of sculpture and painting. I do it through story and metaphor. A friend of mine from a colleague at a different college I was at before Bethel, who was the choir director. And we would go to concerts together, go to the symphony. If the symphony was bad, I would have an okay experience. He would have a terrible experience. He would be in almost physical pain for weeks afterwards. If the symphony was great, I would have a pretty good experience, and he would have an ecstatic experience just beyond any, and would be in heaven for the following week. Well, why is that? It's because he heard more than I did. He heard more notes. He could distinguish more of what was going on. He was more engaged in the music than I do. And I want to do that for my students. It's largely show and tell. Look at what Toni Morrison is doing here. Look at what Kurt Vonnegut is doing in this book. And for me, it's tuning the ear to see more out of the work, because then you see more out of your life. You notice more out of your life. It makes you more sensitive to what's going on around you. Dale Johnson, my first year here, was writing poetry, wanted me to look at, knew I had been a poetry editor before, wanted me to look at some of his poems, and I said, well, I didn't take any painting classes. The males in southern Minnesota didn't take any literature courses that they didn't need, and they didn't take art courses. And I would like to be able to paint because, as a writer, I just sit in front of a keyboard. As a painter, you get the smells and the colors, you get dirty and you get movement. I want to be able to do that. I told him I'm going to take one of your classes, and he said, let's go. I'll give you some lessons. That afternoon, we went out to the lawn here, and he did a dramatic Dale Johnson, like, how many colors do you see? And I think I picked out like 3 or 4 colors. There's some green there, there's the different color green of the pond that's there and the cement color, and he said, no, no, there are, I can't remember the numbers, like 15 different colors right here in this square foot. And he began pointing them out to me, that you see the way the sun hits, comes through that tree, and it makes that blade of grass, just a sliver of that blade of grass blue. And there's just a sliver there of red. And as he pointed them out, I could see them. And I thought that's what teaching is. It's pointing out what they do, that there's more here that you don't see, because there's more in their lives that they don't see as well, and to remain vital and open to the world. And again, it's not blocking out any of the evil. How could we do that the day after, there's another school shooting? That there is darkness in the world as well. But to embrace all of it, I think, is one of the things that literature and creative writing and even film can do for students.
I have a responsibility early on in a class to let the students know where I come from. So that means at some time I will share my personal story about coming to Christ and something about my journey.
I'm much more free in a Bethel classroom than I was in a Yale classroom. I mean, the way it really hit home was, I remember talking about Hitler and Stalin in a 20th century European history class, and I was the TA running a couple of sections, and I remember a moment one night thinking, like, we should be talking about evil, and I don't know how to do that at Yale exactly, and I'm sure there are people who do it well, I just didn't know how to do it, but I'm never afraid to do that here. We spent a whole week on the Holocaust in modern Europe, and it's heartbreaking every single time. And we talk about the problem of evil. We ask where God is, and we listen to Jewish voices who decide that God was not there, and we try to honor that perspective, and we pray together, and we confess our sins together. So I just know I couldn't do that except in this kind of institution.
I don't see myself as a preacher. I don't see myself as a counselor. I don't see myself as in those kind of metaphoric stages. But if you walked into my class and sat down, you would probably think, my word, this is mass confusion. Because I'm all over the classroom. I try to be in family, by each family unit at least 3 times in a class. There's a lot of noise. And I have this little holler that I do when I want everybody to shut up, and they do it. And I think about that classroom now and the classroom that I will have this afternoon, and when I started at Bethel. And when I started at Bethel, I lectured straight. Lecture, 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 lecture. And I do lecture some, but I'm careful about the time. And I know that if you have huge classes like you do, what I'm saying to you would seem like mass chaos. But it's the way that it works best to use a variety of approaches, I think.
I love nothing more than talking with people about what I'm learning. It doesn't have to be, I want a room full of people who listen with rapt attention to my every word, although there are days when that's nice. But I love being a part of stimulating conversations. And so, the best class, in my view, is one where I've been reading or rereading something and I've noticed something new, or I have a question, or I realize, oh, this relates to this. And I come into class and I'll say, here's some ideas I have, what do you guys think about this? And in an ideal world, I'll have at least some students who say, hey, I noticed this, and especially if it's something that I hadn't noticed before.
On a great day, my students would be doing more talking than I would be. They'd be engaging with each other and on the walls and really just energizing the space with ideas and thinking deeply about the ideas that we're working through.
To me, active engagement does not necessarily mean something physical that they're doing, but it means is their mind engaged, you know, and oftentimes it helps to have their body engaged in some way. But I'm really interested in, are they thinking deeply about things? Are they being challenged? Are they being inspired? Are they being supported? You know, those are the things that I'm trying to see are really happening. If there's ever a phrase that I'm going to be famous for saying about teaching, it would be this phrase: whoever does the most work learns the most.
I think I was most successful in classes where students were comfortable with letting me be a fellow learner. And I hope I haven't lost that, because I genuinely do care about learning along with students, and I think no matter how long I teach, I'm going to be able to learn something from even 18-year-old students.
My teaching philosophy in the arts is really that everything comes from the experience of like the hands moving. You know, it's like if the hands are going, and so I start with that. It's like all the projects that I generate, all the projects that I give my student, you know, require physical making. They're not pieces that maybe start so much on the drawing board and transition to that. They're pieces that start with, here's the 2x4, you got to cut up the 2x4 into little bits, and then you got to glue those together to do a thing. One of my instructors along the way used to say, you know, if you get stuck in the studio, just sweep the floor. And like, it's amazing how often that works. I mean, it's a trick that I use myself. It's like I get stuck, I just start cleaning. And there is something about that experience, which I think is something we don't value so much in a Western society, where most of our ideas are highly analytical. We don't tend to think in those terms. Our theology at a place like Bethel doesn't tend to affirm, you know, the value of, you know, sort of physical action, physical motion. I think we're better now than we used to be, but even so, still, we tend to minimize that a lot more, where other parts of the world, I think, have a greater understanding of the connection between mind and body.
I think I've gotten better at recognizing and trying to figure out how to deal with the category of student who clearly is engaged and clearly wants to learn, but is just naturally really quiet in the classroom. And I used to take it personally if students didn't feel comfortable speaking or asking a question, or I would put a lot of points into class participation, and class participation would be defined as, well, who's comfortable talking? And so one thing I've deliberately worked on is how can I make class a good learning experience for a wider range of personality types? How can I encourage the quiet people, especially the quiet people who are doing the work and who are thinking, to kind of come out of their shell a little bit and contribute to class?
Trial and error is still really important. I'm not afraid to try something. I'm much less afraid to fail at something at this point in my career, and I'm pretty transparent about that with students. Like, we're going to roll out this new technology. Let's see if it works. I don't like it when it doesn't work, but I understand that's part of the process.
We have to work very hard to sort of acclimate them to this idea that failure is a really good thing. Creative practices, it's kind of this class of unrelenting experimentation. They literally just have to experiment for 90 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 14 weeks. That's the whole class, is just sort of this relentless experimentation. And it's amazing that the progress that they make when faced with that kind of activity.
One of the things I love about teaching, especially in a traditional schedule like we have, is in September you start out fresh, you know, or at the beginning of the term you start out fresh, you try some things at the end of the term, you look back and say, did they work? What can I do better next time? And there aren't many jobs where you get to do something over and over and over until you get it right, or closer to right.
I did this study where I interviewed about 75 or 80 mid-career artists to figure out how they work, and I found that actually this kind of relationship to time is one of the biggest indicators of a successful practice. It's students, when you give students a project, what students will most frequently do is they will try to figure out a way to get the project done successfully in the least amount of time. This is America, that's what we do. We're all about efficiency. Professional artists, pros, the people who are having really successful careers, they don't work like that. What they do is that they set hours around their time. So they say every day I'm going to be in my studio from 9 to 3 in the afternoon. And during that time I'm just going to work. And I'll work on things that I have, and when I'm done working on projects that I've pitched or obligations that I have, I'm going to work on other things. And so rather than meeting objectives, the objectives suddenly kind of get tossed out the window to some degree. Or maybe I would say they get kind of exploded and they get expanded. And so the artist is constantly saying to themselves, oh, this is an interesting thing that I just completed, I'm done with it. You know, I've got another hour and a half. It's like, what if I take this thing and I turn it inside out and I try it this other way? And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of relationship that's super important in developing a strong and vibrant, a robust practice.
The whole idea of figuring out where your students are intellectually, where they are developmentally, and trying to teach to that where they are, and then providing them experiences that will help them grow, I mean, that's kind of simple. But we don't usually think about that in college. We tend to focus on our discipline rather than, to me, we need to focus on the student as well. I'm not saying the discipline doesn't matter. It matters a lot. But it's how do we introduce the discipline to the student and the student to the discipline. It's a two-way street.
I think that teaching involves teaching social skills in college just as much as it does teaching content, and that's not something that stops once a student finishes their K through 12 education. So increasingly now over the last few years, I've worked a lot more on how do I help students learn to become good listeners? How do I help students learn to sit with uncomfortable topics? Some of those things that we need more in our society to promote civility and civil discourse, I try to think about, well, how do I help teach students how to do that in the classroom?
My goals for them is to be better persons when they walk out. So somewhere along the line, and probably because of my work in college student development, the idea that I'm not just teaching a discipline, I'm teaching life skills, I'm teaching character.
I am a person who is pretty empathetic, and so it's fairly easy for me to think about or imagine what it would be like to be in someone else's shoes, or to try to picture what someone else's view of the world would be. And so I think that figures into teaching in a couple of different ways, because I spend a lot of time thinking about what's it like to be the student sitting in the chair in the classroom, and how do I get them engaged in a topic, how do I inspire them, how do I build trust with them and lower the risk or perceived fear that they might have about a class. But then also in terms of trying to get students to be able to read empathetically and listen empathetically and study other topics with a position of empathy. That's something I really try to cultivate in my teaching.
I'm also kind of an advocate of naming the elephant in the room. And if people are having a hard time focusing, we have a conversation about what's in the way of people being able to focus on what it is that we're trying to do.
In most of my classes early on, we talk about the principle of charity. So how do you read and interact with another idea, whether that's an idea from someone in the classroom, an idea we're encountering in a film or a textbook? How do you take a spirit of charity to that idea? And by charity, I mean trying to understand that idea for what it really is, and trying to understand the reasons why someone else holds that idea. I'll often tell students very few people have really stupid ideas for their strongest beliefs. Just because you don't understand them doesn't make them stupid. And so trying to help students understand what is someone else's good reason for this belief that they have. And so I'll often ask students a question of, what did the other person get right? What did Marx get right? Or what did Socrates get right? Even if you don't agree with the conclusion, you can still say there's something true about this view of the world, or true at least about the way they ask the question.
I love it when students have aha experiences. And if that was my fundamental goal in life, which is to help people have insight experiences, whether it's in counseling or mentoring or teaching or mediation, that's what's satisfying.
I can remember giving a chapel once where I had an acoustic gadget up in front, and I sort of said, when I teach, I want to be like this gadget, because it was the gadget was a musical instrument, and it had what we would call resonance. What a resonance does is separates the wall there, and the source of the energy, in this case the teacher, the classroom or lab, has to interact with the receptor, the students, and the receptors are feeding back information to the source and impacting what you do. So my model of quality teaching is that of resonance, and you can't do it without feedback. I've been very involved nationally in the American Association of Physics Teachers, and there's a growing tendency to view teaching as a science, much more than we used to do. And from it we learn so much, so that science of teaching is increasingly obvious. But at times, I have to admit, to me, when you approach it too much that way, I have some pushback. I fall in love with physics so easily that, to me, to study intently and with data and so forth exactly how students are learning or not learning it is not what really makes me tick. So the science of physics teaching, for example, to me is a powerful tool. For me, it's almost like math. I enjoy math as a tool to do physics with. Teaching has to be studied carefully, and it's more of a science than most of us have been brought up to think of it being. And those who study it scientifically have so much to teach us. The science teaching is increasingly important to me, and even when I've at times pushed back because it seems to be taking the art away.
There are things that especially neuroscientists are learning and are starting to make evident in ways that non-neuroscientists can understand about how the brain works, about the kinds of things that therefore help to assist memory and help to assist learning. If I know those kinds of things, and that can then shape the way I teach or the way I communicate with my students, I can increase the likelihood that I can help them learn better.
I believe teaching is, first of all, a calling. And then second of all, I believe it's a craft that you develop. Some people are natural teachers, and some people have to work hard to become good teachers, but I think you could be a natural teacher called to teach. Unless you learn the pedagogy of it, the craft of it, you're not going to ever be as good as you possibly could be.
Teaching is not something you ever figure out and then you're there. It is a lifelong pursuit. And I do think there's real danger in faculty who think, oh, I've got this whole thing figured out now, and I can just kind of go on autopilot and do what has worked in the past. So for me, I purposely change up what I do, just so I'm trying new things, so I'm still feeling what it feels like to be somewhat of a new teacher and trying something new for the first time. I think it's really critical. And I'll let them know sometimes, I've never done this before, but I really want to try it. And I want them to see me in that role of somebody that's, that's really professionally growing and learning as well.
Several years ago, this idea of inverting the classroom or flipping the classroom was like the hottest thing to hit education in, 20 years since the previous innovation. And I think people thought that that was the science, right? It was the token, like I'm gonna flip and therefore I'm going to be an excellent instructor. And what we saw happen, not just at Bethel, but across the country, was so many people flipped and tried to model just on the principle alone, but they miss the heart behind it, right? They miss the craft or the art portion of it. And we had frustrated students with overwhelmed workloads because now their entire curriculum basically has been moved before the class time, and so they're juggling jobs and all this content, and they're trying to work through it, and then they get in the classroom, and the teacher was supposed to do some sort of hands-on activity with them, and those activities maybe were not very mindfully engaging the content, and collectively we saw this, maybe flipping isn't the end-all, be-all from the classroom experience. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of value to doing flipping the right way, but I think it's a good example of how it's not just a science. We have a lot of research literature about what is working in the classroom, but in order to effectively implement that, you have to know why it's working, and you have to know how to apply it in your particular context. So who are your students? What are their needs? How are their needs changing even over the course of the semester?
Art is valuable because it's provocative. I think teaching is valuable in the same way. Teaching is about provoking someone to think or react, not controlling the way that they think or act, or not dictating what the answer they come up with must be, but opening up a space, provoking a space in which people will interact with ideas that then moves them forward.
As a historian, I believe really deeply in complexity as an organizing way of thinking. And so I am almost tempted to believe that teaching is irreducible complexity, because it's, as my graduate advisor said, molecules with minds of their own. I'm generally kind of suspicious of our ability to reduce any kind of thing that's fundamentally about human interactions to some kind of science. Because there are certain classes I've taught 30 different times, and every single one of them, even though it seems from the outside to be 99% exactly the same, is fundamentally different, because at the very least, the 17 students in my CWC discussion section are all different. The way they interact with each other is different. I am different than I was. I'm fundamentally changing in certain ways. The world beyond us is changing. So even though it seems like the history is the same, the narrative is the same, the number of tests is the same, I'm just suspicious. I think the number of variables is so great, I'm not really sure how to think of teaching as a science. And so probably to a fault, I tend to view scientific studies of teaching with a great deal of suspicion. It's artisanal. It's not something everyone can do. I am firmly convinced not everyone is meant to be a teacher. And you can't just give them best practices and give them a little training and say, now you're going to be a great teacher. I really think it's a calling. And it's a spiritual gift. I do think then there's a kind of genius to it. I really don't think all art is equally good, right? I think we all have a kind of flicker of recognition of when we see art that is truly wonderful. And I think that's probably true of teaching. And I think that's why we can all answer that question of who is the best teacher you ever, there is something about that person that I don't think could be handed down through best practices or even identified through scientific study. I certainly don't want to make it sound like I identify that in myself, but I do think it's something miraculous, the way that good teaching can shape a student.
The strength of a teacher in front of a larger group of people is really based on the relationship that they've been able to build with the individuals in that classroom. And I think that if you've been successful in building some kind of a meaningful relationship with each student, when you stand in front of them, and there could be 50 people in the room, 75, 150 people in the room, if you've somehow been able to manage to build that relationship with the individual students, they then see that teaching, you in the front of the room, is something that's really directed to them. They feel that you're literally talking to them. You're working with them in some way.
What has become a tradition here is that you care about your students. They're not robots, they're not a sea of audience, they are individuals with lives beyond your classroom, and that we need to meet them where they are and find ways to help them care about their education and care about the things that you're trying to teach them, and sort of unlock their passions like that graduate student back at the University of Colorado did for me.
One student that I remember, she was a first-generation college student, came from a home that we wouldn't think of as kind of a typical, you know, Bethel family, if you will. She had come here because her boyfriend came here, and so she was not as much kind of a part of the culture that some students might be. And I had her in college writing, and she was she was really struggling. So I had her come in, and we sat down in my office, and she just, you know, she talked about her life and all the different things that she was, you know, trying to adjust to at Bethel, and it helped me look at her differently. Like, okay, she's not just a student who isn't getting her work done. She's somebody who has some pretty specific struggles that she's working with. And how can we make this class a place that's going to help her learn what she needs to learn? In fact, I ended up giving her a key to my office because one of the things she didn't have was a good place to study. She just came in and worked in my office, gave the key back at the end of the term, and that's the kind of thing I think that good teachers do, is they pay attention to their student needs.
There is a piece of learning that requires motivation, right? And you can have internal motivation, but a lot of times we need some sort of external push to even maybe find that internal motivation, and relationships can be a really powerful piece of that motivator. I think when students feel safe, when they feel welcome, when they feel like they matter and they have value, there's value added to them being in the space, they're so much more likely to contribute. They're more likely to let their guard down and say, I don't have to kind of wear this mask that says, I think I get it, and I want to save face and kind of pretend that I get it. They're willing to step back and say, you know, I don't get it. You know, I had a student just the other day tell me, when you came over and you talked to me about my model, I was so nervous I could hardly hear what you were going to say to me. And then I stepped back and I reflected on it afterwards, and it was exactly what I needed. And now I realize that you're here to help me. You know, you're not here to judge me. And I think that's kind of the aura that I want to create in the classroom, right? That community, which is built on relationship.
I'm a teacher all the time in how I interact with students, and so I think that I've had some major impacts on students by working with them as my TAs or working with them as being tutors as well, because you're interacting with them kind of when you're just yourself and you're in your office and they see the true you. They see how you interact with life and with your discipline. So they get to see kind of a deeper look into who you are as a person, how you're balancing your different roles, how you're integrating your faith into your life, how you live that out, how you act under stress, how you manage tasks.
I, even more than before, feel I have to know the students well. Whereas as a young professor, I don't think I was quite as aware of that. While at Bethel, in a way, research has been my thing. It's doing the research first and then taking that into the lecture room and into the laboratory. That's what's made me tick.
One of the things that makes Bethel unique is that we engage with our students beyond, you know, you got an A on this test, you've got a D on this test, you're flunking this test. We ask the follow-up questions. So what's getting in the way of you being successful? And we sometimes find out things that we would prefer not to know, and yet we do know them, and that's why we have the kinds of support systems that we do at an institution like this.
somehow we have to be sensitive to where the students are really at. And we all know that, of course, but to take the time to do it. I mean, as I'm retiring more fully these days, I certainly have regrets of where I've failed to do that. Sometimes I think I needed to publish fewer papers and get to know more students better. How many of them do we really know?
There are stories that we don't know about, but I'm going to tell one, which is several years ago we had a woman whose mother was dying of cancer, and her mother's wish was to see her daughter graduate. And so Joel and Jay and several other people got together, and they put together an early graduation ceremony for this woman and her family, and so her mother got to see her graduate. So, I mean, these are the things that make, we forget sometimes, but these are the things that make Bethel, Bethel.
When I teach my World War II class, I use the Ken Burns, Jeffrey Ward documentary series. One of my favorite parts comes near the end, when he's interviewing Paul Fussell, who eventually became a great literature scholar, was Dan Ritchie's mentor, wrote this great book on the Great War in Modern Memory that all of us read in the 90s. But Paul Fussell, during the war, was just a young guy, I think from Pennsylvania, who was an infantry lieutenant. And he reflected on being told by Dwight Eisenhower about D-Day. And Eisenhower said it was this great crusade we're going on. And Fussell said it was a dud. Right? Because all they were doing was gambling, drinking, womanizer. It was a great adventure, maybe, plus there was a sense of fatalism, but like, there's no sense of there's a greater purpose to it. It was just the adventure, right? And they may or may not die. And then there's a moment where he talks about coming into Germany in like February, March of 1945, and his unit happened to liberate a concentration camp. And I forgot what he said exactly, but I don't think he knew that was there. He certainly wasn't fighting for that purpose. Like, almost no American soldiers were fighting for liberty, for democracy. They did surveys. That was never what they said. They certainly were not fighting for Jews. They were not fighting to end the Holocaust. And he got there, and I can't talk about it without crying, but because that's what happens to him, is he said, like, he got there, and to his surprise, he realized like, it was a crusade, like there was purpose here to it. And so it's awkward to make this comparison because in a way there's nothing like studying history or French literature or chemistry and doing World War II or liberating concentration camp. But what I took away from that and what I talk about with students in that moment is we do things and we think we know the reasons we do things. But then there's the purpose, which maybe has to be revealed to us later. And maybe it doesn't even come from us. I mean, as a Christian, maybe that's something coming from God. And maybe we need other people to help us understand it. And I think fundamentally that is the nature of education, and certainly a liberal arts institution. It is about finding purpose and trusting that you will discover that, not really knowing what it is. Like, our students come here thinking they know the reason they're at Bethel. They think they know why they're taking these classes. I think I know why I'm teaching these classes, and in some sense we do, but I think fundamentally we have no idea. It will become clear to us as a glimmer here at various points in our life. We'll have a flash of recognition of like, that's why I was in that class, that's why I read that book, that's why I had that major. We even use language that sounds very idealistic, and then we tend to shun it and snicker at it and think, no, it's a job or it's the grand adventures. And then you have a kind of moment where you realize, no, here was the purpose, and it was woven in all the time, and you didn't realize it. And all you can do is to be faithful and to trust that you were doing what you were called to do.
I'm probably 15 years from retirement. I'm really at a spot now where I'm thinking, okay, what might be the next stage, right? What do I want to do so I don't, burn out or coast? What are the parts of my job that I love and want to be sure I get to do more of? What are the parts of my job that maybe it's someone else's turn to do those things? So I'm not sure what the next stage looks like. I think we're a lot better at bringing people into teaching than we are at kind of thinking about how to make the most of the ends of their career.
In the end, I'm more concerned about who they are than what they know. And I don't want that to come across as, she doesn't care about what they know, but I really want them to know and I want them to be the best, but that isn't the end-all, be-all of why they're here. They are here to develop as people, as learners. I want them to leave here knowing who they are, knowing what they believe, knowing how that interfaces with their science, and knowing their science inside out and backwards. I want them to be so fluid with it that it just rolls off their tongue and that it's always playing in their background knowledge in their head, because then they're going to be able to innovate if they have that solid foundation. And their innovation is going to be driven by what's on their heart.
As I look at my students, one of my secret goals for them, maybe not so secret, is that these will be the people that are on the school boards when I'm retired. These are the people that are going to be in the House and Senate. These are the people that are going to be making decisions about our society. These are the people that are going to be pastoring our churches. So I feel like working here gives me this opportunity to shape the future because I'm contributing to these amazing students' education and seeing them go out into the world and really making a difference. Not so much by what they do, although they do amazing things, but just by who they are.
It was always from the very beginning one of my goals to make sure that I sort of reproduced somebody like me from among my students, to replace me. I won't be here forever, and I cared enough about my field that I really wanted to see it continue and grow, and so it seemed important to me from the very beginning that somewhere along the way at least a few of the students that I helped to encourage along turned out to be cognitive psychologists. That just seemed important, I guess. There were only a few in retrospect, but that's all right. It was enough.
I would hope that they would say that I challenged them to do good work and to ask important questions, but that I also gave them the support that they need in order to be able to do that work. So I would hope that a struggling student would say, she helped to support me so that I could do what I was able to do in that class. And I hope that especially a stronger student would say, she challenged me not to slack off.
I think they would say that I really care about them as individuals. I think they would say that I really have their back. And I think particularly students of color, students where English is a second language for them, I think they would say that I really, really do have their back, and I've really put their interests really foremost in my mind. I think they would say that I'm wise. That's it's an emotional thing to think about, because I'm thinking about legacy right now, obviously, and those are the things that I feel really good, about them saying.
I would hope that former students said, she made a difference in my life. I would hope they would say, I'm where I'm at today because she believed in me. That's really important to me.
I would hope that they would say that I prepared them to do the next thing. That, if it's inquiry seminar, that I prepared them to do better in their later college classes. If it's the methods course, that I prepared them for going into teaching.
I'd want them to say that I pushed them. That's part of me saying that. That's the part that, as a physicist, which can be at times kind of an elitist discipline, But I still value that, and I would not want the students to say that it was just enjoyable and I didn't push them. Even the very best students need to be pushed. So I want them to be challenged, and I want them to be sustained and affirmed by what they've learned about the wonders of physics.
I would hope they would say, I can remember and I put into practice some of the things Dr. Fraser taught me. I would hope they would say, she was one tough teacher. I would hope they'd say, we had fun in our class. Because I like to laugh with my students.
It would be nice to be considered wise. I'm not always making, I don't make perfect decisions. But I hope that they would see me as transparent and encouraging of them to be the people that they can be.
I hope they all have some sense of like, this does not come from a place of I'm doing it because it's my job, even though it is my job. I'm not doing it simply because there's nothing else I could do. I'm doing it because I deeply love God, that the best way of doing that for me is to love history, and the best way of doing that for me is to teach students. And so I hope all of those loves in some way, are at least kind of humming beneath the surface and occasionally are breaking through.
I hope they think that I showed them some beautiful things in literature.
There's a character, I think it's in Catch-22, who was an English major, and it says that he learned everything about literature except how to enjoy it. And I know when you're reading something for an assignment, it's not nearly as much fun as reading it on your own. When you're going to have to take a quiz on it, when you're going to have to write a paper. And I'm very conscious of that because these are great works in part because they're fun on their own. And that idea of pleasure, I just hate if I'm sucking that out of their experience of the work. Before every class, though, I'm nervous. I'm a bit high-strung anyway. The nervous person anyway, so I sort of feed off that, and I don't know if it's going to work, and I want it to be great. I want every student in my class to have the best experience in a class that they've ever had. I want it to be that.
What we're really good at is helping students learn to sit in the middle of difficult places and issues. We're not the most conservative school, we're not the most liberal school. We have a lot of diversity of perspectives in the faculty, and students will be exposed to that, and let's just embrace that and sell it. I mean, what does our world actually need right now? People who are better sitting in the middle than polarizing at the two extremes.
We have to look for the new directions in which to move, but as we move in those directions, we've got to bring our heritage along with us. It won't be the thing that today's society and the young people and their parents are going to think that they want when they're looking at colleges. But we have to keep it with us anyway, and we have to find the right ways to sell it, I suppose, is the best term I can think of. I don't like that term. I don't think that education is some kind of a product that we should ever be thinking of our programs and our mission as product, that we're trying to produce. Education is a transformation, and the students who come here should not be expecting to leave with something in hand so much as they are expecting to leave a different person.
I would love for students to think about their education as a chance to do what they love. Yes, there's the pressure of a career and paying back the student loans, and I do not in any way want to undermine that. But if you allow yourself to pursue the path you love, you will get to the place where you have a meaningful career and that passion and those skills pour into it. So to not feel like I did as a student, well, you know, as a female, my 3 choices are to be a secretary, an elementary ed teacher, or a nurse, because that's what women do. And then you get married and have kids and stay home, so what you pick doesn't matter. Anyways, you know, and to get to say, no, I'm gonna actually figure out what I'm wired to do and what I love. So I would advise them to take a class just because it sounds fun, because you never know where that might lead you. Or to ask your professors, what do they read? What do they read outside of class? What are their favorite books? And start reading those things and see what path that takes you on.
By the time students get here, they've had 15, 16, 17, 18 years of people telling them who they are and what they're successful at. And grades can be terrible in this way. But I think that by the time students get here, they, like I said, they've had so much content, so many people telling them like who they are, that you know, it's time to just tell all those people, thanks very much, but please go away. And just really listen to, like, what is the thing that sort of gets you going? You know, like where do you find the line of inquiry for yourself that's fascinating? Like, what sort of fascinates you? And like, do more of that. Literally. I don't necessarily believe that, you know, we're born with a distinctive, you know, interest in mind, or a mission, or a vocation, or a, you know, calling, or whatever. I think in my case, I kind of was, you know, like an artist. I'm glad I found this thing. Otherwise, I'd have just been a bad carpenter all my life, kind of making things that I didn't really want to make. But I do think that we are not given useless gifts. And in a place like Bethel University, it's very easy, because this place will affirm a lot of things that are useful for the Christian faith. That's not necessarily what God wants you to do, you know? It's like, it's not necessarily what you should do. I heard this guy talk a while back. A guy came and spoke to my church. This guy was a missionary. It's like all his life he kind of felt like he needed, like he was that person, the guy who was really driven. You know, he had a heart for missions and wanted to do it, and became a missionary, and was doing it, and had gotten funding, and he was in Indonesia, and he's standing there in the shower one day, and kind of just, he's miserable. He's literally sort of weeping in the shower, because he sees this insect climbing up the wall of the shower, and all he wants to do is to paint that insect. That's all. That's really interesting to me, because, you know, so he quit being a missionary, and he went to become a painter, and now now it's like his life is working for him, you know. You know, he was miserable before. He couldn't stand it. He hated everything he was doing, even though from, you know, our perspective here at Bethel, he was doing a lot of great stuff. You know, his faith told him he was doing a lot of stuff. His perception of God told him, you know, you're doing some great stuff. But all he wanted to do was to paint that bug. And he kind of heard a voice. He relays that he heard a voice telling him, paint the bug. You know, so he did. Now he's having this career, he's still in the visual arts, he's finding ways to make that work, and it's really working for him. So I would say, you know, quit telling yourself what you're experiencing, and listen to what you're experiencing. What are you really interested in? God doesn't give us useless gifts.